Hi, my name is Rachel Saunders, and welcome to this episode of the Temporal Hospitality podcast. In this episode, we're going to be looking at Nazi Germany's House of Cards, in particular the economics and moral philosophy underpinning the Third Reich. Like all ideologies, National Socialism was formulated by certain people to appeal to a wide variety of minds. Natural romanticism and mysticism were the foundations of National Socialist ideology, and a rationalist philosophy designed to progress Germany in opposition to the perceived rationalism that brought about the Versailles Treaty and the Weimar Republic. The notion of blood and soil in opposition to the decadent city life rooted Germanness in work and sacrifice, with the outer life a silhouette of the soul. The notion of Volksgemeinschaft, national spirit, evoked a unification of blood, work, and national self-sufficiency, which became the roots of the National Socialist economic model and the conflagration that they brought about through their desire for Lebensraum and a pure German ethno-state. In this podcast, I unpack National Socialist economic policies, showing that far from being a strong utopia that they publicised in propaganda, the regime was actually a house of cards which needed extractive conquest to keep itself going. Alongside this, the spiritualist movement of blood and soil, which rooted the German nation in an Aryan peasant paradise, led to the mechanised slaughter of millions of innocents. For all its accomplishments, it was the business of the National Socialist state that sought to restore German glory that drove Germany to destruction. Those who crave an authoritarian hand on the tiller, backed by a handful of billionaire oligarchs and religious convictions, need to be mindful that when such a regime attempts to wield power, the results are disastrous for the nation and its people. Much has been made of the economic miracle that appears in the data relating to the German war effort, yet the data and figures have rarely been critiqued. What has been publicised both in popular history and fictionalised narratives is the version presented by the German War Ministry, in particular the notion that Germany tried to keep a peacetime economy until the war turned against them in 1943. Deconstructing the myths of the National Socialist economy are important to show why we should never trust data and statistics at face value, seeing them all as propaganda until we have been able to analyse them in context. As Rolf Dieter Müller highlights, there is a need to understand the gravitational pull of data on our understanding of National Socialist Germany, especially when it is used to reinforce the legend that the National Socialists were good stewards of Germany throughout their regime. In my opinion, it is the lionising of National Socialist economic policy, especially the stewardship of Hjalmar Schacht and Albert Speer, which disguise these failures. Unlike Soviet Russia, which collapsed under the weight of economic failures in 1991, National Socialist Germany was defeated in 1945 through warfare. Yes, this defeat stemmed from an inability to economically compete with the industrial output of the Allies, but the narrative told in textbooks and films shows that the German economy was resilient and able to semi-function right to the end of the war. And what sunk it was a wrong turn into Wunderwaffen and over-engineered war material. In reality, the German war machine was predicated on the suffering of slave labour, the indentured of hundreds of thousands from occupied territories, and the extraction of wealth from invaded countries. Without this human suffering and avaricious expropriation, the German war machine would have been impossible. In 1933, Germany faced a stark future as the ravages of the Great Depression led to a polarisation of politics, which led a group of German industrialists to team up with right-wing politicians to offer the National Socialists the keys to power. The subsequent period between 1933 and 1939 have been variously painted as an economic miracle and a tightrope that the German finance minister Hjalmar Schacht walked to feed the regime's desire to rebuild the German war machine. While the Germans' failure to mass-produce war material was a cause of their defeat in World War II, the economic system they instituted was bound to fail even if their conquest had succeeded. It bears remembering that all economic theories are rooted in social theories about how society ought to work. The world in 1933 faced three competing visions: liberal capitalism, communism, and a hybrid model proposed by fascists which married reactionary values with various forms of nationalism. National Socialism was founded on a primitive metaphysical view of the supremacy of the German people, holding that economics are derived from this philosophy. German leaders sought to reawaken and restore spiritual values, to reshape faith and will through blood and soil. The totalitarian principle of the National Socialist state is rooted in the supremacy of the nation, with economics rooted in the need to uphold this higher power. Lederer draws out that under the National Socialist system, all social activity was in service of the state, and that unbridled economic competition would lead to national destruction. Essentially, the National Socialists co-opted the desire for individual spending and personal growth into autarkic principles that the nation mattered above all else. Germanic economic theory had long-standing issues with the significance of this tenet, a problem exacerbated but not originated by the basic inhumanity of Nazi doctrine. National Socialist doctrine kept women out of the workforce as much as possible, reduced gypsies, Jews and LGBTQ+ folk to Untermenschen, and treated Slavs as little more than a slave labour force to be worked to death. The need to control people, to purify the population, led to economic policies which degraded the moral fabric of the German nation and broke apart whole sections of society for the sake of personal and corporate power. It is not enough to decry the crimes against humanity and mass slaughter of millions. It is vital to address the underpinnings and moral decay and utter banality of the economic system that drove it. In part, this is what sets apart the National Socialist regime from other fascists. They co-opted autocratic brutality, apartheid segregation, and capitalist desire for enrichment. A central tenet of the National Socialist platform was the undoing of the Treaty of Versailles and obtaining Lebensraum for the German Volk to ensure that the country could become self-sufficient, essentially become autarkic. To do this, the Führer and his ministers co-opted German industry to start producing arms, at first in secret, and then post-1936 openly. This enabled a handful of industrialists to line their own pockets, while in turn they turned a blind eye to the endemic abuses and corruption which swept across German society. To fuel this industrialisation, the German finance ministry used MEFO bills to borrow money from the German Reichsbank without breaking existing statutes, then used to pay businesses for rearmament. The catch was that because Germany did not have significant foreign currency reserves, the cost of importing goods almost bankrupted the country. Thus, there was a critical need to bring in new resources and labour to keep German rearmament going. This need to extract more resources and money led to the German annexation of Austria in the Austrian Anschluss of 1938 and the eventual annexation of Czechoslovakia across 1938 and 1939. As The Guardian outlines, in October 1938, the annexation of the Sudetenland brought with it industrial capacity, mineral wealth and additional labour, along with a machinery of suppression brought to bear on the newly occupied territories. Going back as far as 1933, the National Socialists had instigated a regime of terror against Jewish Germans, expropriating property and wealth from them to redistribute to loyal Germans. So both external and internal extraction of wealth was fundamental to propagating the regime. Indeed, a critical part of the German war machine was the seizure of industry and resources in France, the Low Countries, Poland and Western Russia up until the end of 1941. The most sombre of all these extractive processes are the displays at Auschwitz-Birkenau of the suitcases, glasses, shoes and other items stolen from those murdered to be recycled back into the German war economy. With Czech industrial capacity and weaponry after 1938, the Führer would not have been able to invade Poland or France had he not done this. Or it would have been more likely that the Second World War would have broken out after 1941, because that was when the German generals were planning to do so based on the current economic model. By 1939, Germany was suffering from the product of an increasingly bankrupt political system, which sought to stave off the inevitable social tension between masses and leaders brought about by rapid rearmament and subsequent economic crisis. National Socialism regarded the unity of culture and the state as being based on and directed by both a rigidly fixed dogma and a nebulousness born out of the Führer principle that all Germans must obey the will of the Führer. Rybak draws out the fact that at the beginning of the National Socialist regime, there was a tension between the socialist elements of Alfred Hugenberg and Ernst Röhm, who wanted to redistribute wealth to workers and peasants, and industrialists such as Fritz Thyssen and the Krupp family, who wanted to centre power on the industrialists. Hugenberg was quickly sidelined in 1933, and after the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, it was the industrialists who achieved economic control within the National Socialist state. The destruction of Jewish wealth, in part led by Adolf Eichmann and the SS, was a result of this ideological purification of the state. Extractive economics drew from the dogma, enriching a few at the expense of the suffering of many. Dorothy Thompson points out that even cancer specialists were supposed to practice medicine in a National Socialist manner without any understanding of what that actually meant. Science and industry were carried out based on will, faith, and fashion rather than with inquiring minds, leading to a schism between those who valued liberal science and those who were devoted to the party. As Thompson notes, what can be built and created is controlled by an army of bureaucrats and spies, a cultural inquisition that has the force to back up its final words on what ought to be done. This led to science and industrial practices co-opted towards eugenics, concentration camps, and eventually the widespread use of slave labour and industrialised mass murder. From the start of the Second World War, in August 1939, the German war economy suffered from disastrous inefficiencies, leading to shortages in war material caused by political incoherence within the National Socialist regime. It was only through Albert Speer's centralisation of decision-making and breaking of the ideological hold on the apparatus of the state that production output peaked in 1944. Yet, as Tooze outlines, any attempt of making sense of economics through interpreting data must first account for the sloppiness and inconsistencies in that data. One of the key points is that after 1942, the Luftwaffe managed to increase aircraft production of tried and tested aircraft rather than producing new ones, in effect putting efficiency over being cutting edge, which in turn led to significant problems in the air war after 1942. For all the prowess of projects such as the Tiger and their rocketry program, the truth was that National Socialist Germany was a grim place to be a worker. It is a myth that Nazi Germany was an economic powerhouse, as under the National Socialists the German economy was a house of cards reliant on extractive processes to keep going. The average German worker was forced to work longer hours for less pay, with women forced out of the workplace to be mothers of the next generation of German children in order to feed the coming war machine. Corporations such as Krupp and IG Farben saw increased profits as war material was purchased, that those profits did not create increased living standards for ordinary Germans. The US Air Force outlined after the war that the impact of Allied bombing degraded German cities and work environments, making life harder and difficult for the average German. Indeed, the only result of National Socialist policies was to increase public debt and incite more regulation, restrictions and loss of liberty for all. The National Socialist economic policies were closer to Soviet Russia than other capitalist countries of the time. Schacht and Hermann Göring implemented a form of autarky in attempts to make Germany self-sufficient. This was driven in part due to a lack of foreign currency reserves, as Germany was not exporting goods to other countries. This in turn drove the desire for Lebensraum when raw materials and factories could be obtained to keep the economy going. Tooze highlights that without the expansionist approach, the German economy would eventually have collapsed under the weight of these policies. National Socialism held that unshackled economic activity was the root of such a collapse, meaning that economic activity and national expansion must be guided by social organs which represent the community and the state by force if necessary. William Manchester and Hannah Arendt developed this, showing that German corporations such as Krupp used war contracts to extract wealth from the German state, while also getting into bed with the SS to utilise slave labour as working age men were sucked into the German war machine. Nazi Germany's economic expansion, such as it was built on the ultimately unstable platform of slave labour. As the 1947 Krupp war crimes trial outlined, the extractive processes undertaken by these corporations resulted in the deaths of millions of people, and under National Socialism the economic model relied on propaganda and violence as the tools to enforce the economic will of the state. For example, the only people executed for supplying Zyklon B to the concentration camps were two executives at Tench and Stabanov, the owners of the firm, Bruno Tesch and his co-worker Karl Wienbacher. Every Krupp executive received relatively light punishments, ranging up to 10 years, and even the IG Farben executives did not receive punitive punishments. Industrialists such as Ferdinand Porsche, who benefited greatly from working with the National Socialists, received no punishment at all. Examining National Socialist economics matters for current affairs due to both the economic and ideological links to the regime. Koch Industries in the US, which has funneled billions into Republican campaigns over the past 3 decades, got their initial boost in part from helping the National Socialists complete their third largest oil refinery. Ford and other motor companies benefited from Nazi money and have faced no legal consequences for doing so. Holding big business to account for the economic immorality of the Third Reich should be standard practice, yet, in reality, the intervening 80 years have dulled the edge of their crimes against humanity. In Eichmann in Jerusalem, Hannah Arendt systematically detailed the extractive state apparatus through which the SS stripped Jews of their rights, property and ultimately their lives. Such policies are carried out by governments globally in our current times, including what is presently happening in the United States as ICE enforces punitive immigration policies against those deemed illegal. While there is always a danger in referring back to National Socialist economic policies and attempting to map them onto any modern society, the point stands that all economic models and policies need to be ethical and moral to have legitimacy. This is why it is reasonable to state that Putin's extractive policies towards Ukraine are legitimate, why China's policies towards Tibet and the Uyghurs is immoral, and condemning colonialist policies in general ought to be the gold standard. National Socialist ideology was seductive because it promised easy solutions to complex economic problems, something which MAGA and Putinism seek to do the same. This is why it is vital to show that National Socialism was an economic house of cards built on immoral foundations which ultimately wiped much of Germany off the map via Allied bombing and ground warfare. The old Germany was washed away in a sea of blood and ideology, the blood in the soil, Germany's own citizens. This is what those who stand far-right values forget, that, for all the deaths of outsiders and intervention, ultimately it was the German people that lost everything in their rush to debase their society. The Third Reich was an economic house of cards precisely because it put moral values over the lives of Jews, Roma, Gypsies, homosexuals and the disabled. Blood and soil paved the way to national damnation, and anyone who glorifies them seeks to do the same.